Graeme, it's good to see you. You sit here as the game's most successful Test captain in terms of the number of wins, 53, and the longest serving captain in Test match history. I mean, it's a remarkable achievement. How do you reflect on that?
It's a difficult one to reflect. I mean, it's obviously over an 11-year period. There's a couple of one-day internationals and 2020s thrown in there also. I guess the best way to reflect is in terms of growth and how the early years, being 22 years old, and it was a bit hit and miss at those stages. I think in the early years for me, it was I was really fortunate that I was able to perform with the bat, and that in turn probably allowed me to have the longevity. I started with the 2 double hundreds in England, and that sort of kick-started my sort of captaincy tenure, and probably gave people the patience to stick with me and allow me to grow. The South African team at that stage had fairly a few polarising characters around. We had lost the senior players of Alan Donald and Gary Kirsten and Jonty Rhodes and the like, and there was a new tier of players, and that period was a tough period to manage. It was really post 2007 for me that I really started to grow as a captain, where I started to feel like I came into my own and started to understand, the enormous responsibility, the politics, the sponsors, the fans, and I think most importantly, my own strengths and weaknesses, and how what style of play I wanted the team to play with. I had some real direction in my head in terms of type of players, I think from there, then the next step was the culture. Developing the Protea Fire culture was probably the greatest legacy I've left behind in South African cricket. I think incorporating that value system, what we stood for, it's almost been that extra thing that it all needed to come together.
How much did it come from 05-06 when you were really challenged in Australia? And there's always been such intense competition between Australia and South Africa. And I've heard you talk before about 05-06, sort of the making of you in some ways. And did perhaps the Protea Fire philosophy, to some degree, come from that difficult period, challenging period for you?
No, it didn't come from there. I mean, I think the first stepping stone sort of started to happen there, where I realised, okay, there's more to this, and I've got to really consider and develop and grow as a person. I think I came here. It was a great Australian team. You'd heard so many things about playing in Australia, and you realised when you're here for 2 months that it is as tough as everyone had spoken about. South African cricket hadn't been able to even get close to getting really over the line. Bob, I think it was the early series in the 90s where South Africa bowled beautifully on the last day to salvage a victory. So it had sort of been a beating ground for South African cricket, and I arrived, and certainly it was that we managed to save the test in Perth, but from there on in we were dominated, and it was some real valuable lessons. We had a young, naive team. I tried to take on too much and learned some harsh lessons on that tour, and I think that was the most important thing. At least I was a reflective person. I could walk away, look in the mirror and say, okay, that wasn't good. I can learn from that. So I didn't really have that ego where it wasn't my fault. You sort of, I could balance the two. Maybe on the surface, on the front, I had that, but behind the scenes, I was a really reflective person.
I think from people looking out from the outside would say that before we get to the politics of South Africa, in the new South Africa, there can be no more demanding task in the game than to captain and to open the batting. What does it take mentally to lead for such a long period and to open the batting, take on the fastest bowlers there are?
Yeah, Gary Kirsten always used to say to me, "You got to have a little screw loose to open the batting." It's just the nutters that end up up front. And I always used to joke with the stroke players at 4, 5, and 6 that I always had to do the hard work for them. They can come in and look all pretty for the crowd. But I think it was unique in the fact that even though I managed to score runs in the early days, trying to balance the captaincy pressures, especially if it hadn't gone well in the field, not taking that into my batting, especially with the 10-minute changeovers, trying to stay mentally fresh. So what I created for myself was sort of methods to move from the leadership, the captaincy, almost, and then to focus on my batting. Whether it was, I used to change all my kit. Come off different socks, tights, shirts, literally, and then pad up a certain way, have a routine that my brain would know, okay, now it's batting time. But you still found yourself wondering, at the crease when you weren't on strike, thinking about the position of the game. And it's a far more in-depth position to be than I think probably most cricketers will ever experience. But I think as time went on, I started to get to grips with it. The most difficult thing as a captain and an opening batter is that you're going to go through tough periods. You're facing the new ball. There's tough conditions. But you never get away from the pressure because you've always got to go to the press conference. If you failed in one or two games, the press are always on you straight away. And I think dealing with the pressure and grappling with that inside of yourself, I think is the hardest thing to overcome. And if you can deal with that, you'll be successful.
Well, you had a particular workload, of course, because of the trauma of South African cricket in the post-Cronje period. And, of course, in the new South Africa. Tell us about how familiar were you with the trauma of Cronje and what was expected of you? Did you sense that it was your responsibility to rebuild the pride and passion in South African cricket?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my message was clear that I was a new broom. I was a younger generation. I never got to meet Hansie at all. I think that was kind of a good thing for the administration. It was post a disappointing 2003 World Cup. I think South African cricket had kind of stagnated a little bit and, it maybe lost a little bit of the passion and the direction that it needed. I knew I had those things. I knew I could galvanize. I knew I was good with people, even at a young age. But from an experience perspective and a tactical perspective, I had an immense amount of growth that needed to happen. And it was going to take time to rebuild. I needed to be supported from people around me. To be honest with you, I learnt about leadership. Obviously, you have something in you, but I learnt about leadership through my own experiences, good and bad. I didn't go on any courses. No one put me on a media course. No one put me on a public speaking course. It was like 22 years old, jump in, deal with it, So, that's how I learnt about the job, through those instances.
Who could you turn to at that stage? Was it to your parents or to your best mates or to your teammates? Were there people that you could turn to, or did you shoulder it yourself?
Well, when I had a little bit of, I had a good relationship with Jimmy Cook growing up. He spent a lot of time working on technical stuff with me from a batting perspective. So he was a type of mentor. But I think the area that I was really fortunate, and I get asked this question a lot about the senior players, how did they... the Bouchers, the Callises, the Pollocks, and Teenies, the group of senior guys, how was my relationship with them? But it was actually, incredible. I remember when I got appointed, the guys living in Cape Town phoned me up, took me for a beer to congratulate me, chatted, and it was almost like there was a new enthusiasm in them, that there was this new way forward, and they were excited. And so a lot of it was also learning from them, them listening to me, but also mentoring certain aspects of my leadership, being able to have that open conversation. I'll never forget on my first tour to England in 2003. I was 22 years old, and the selectors would phone me from South Africa, tell me the team, and then I'd have to walk around the team hotel and knock on the door. And these guys had been playing for a lot longer than me, and I have to open the door and I'd walk in and say, "Listen, you're not playing." I remember that being one of the most daunting tasks in the early days. But I think I had this resilience. I think that determination inside myself. I think that was probably my greatest strength at the time. And I wanted it. I wanted to make a success of it. I wasn't going to run away from it. But I think learning, being able to learn and grow was going to be my biggest challenge.
It's interesting. Nelson Mandela was released from jail 10 days after your 9th birthday. Did you have any, or do you have any recall of that day, or what your parents told you about Mandela as you were growing up?
Oh, the history of South Africa is very relevant and in your face when you're growing up. I was a young boy. I didn't, we were a very neutral family. I grew up in a very neutral way. And my parents were very liberal. So it didn't even cross my mind. I knew South Africa was in this place and in this position, but it wasn't how I was brought up. Everything was equal. I didn't even consider it. But I do remember driving in the car on the way home. I think my mother was in the car with me, and I remember hearing on the radio that obviously Nelson Mandela had been released and that there were going to be opportunities for international sports. I remember that moment pretty clear. I think from a cricket perspective, an international cricket perspective, the first time I got to experience it on television that I really remember was the '92 World Cup here in Australia, and I think it was the first World Cup that South Africa competed in after readmission back into sport, and it just seemed so amazing, this whole spectacle on TV, international cricket, and I think that really grabbed my energy and my mental state. I can still remember getting up in the early hours, pulling my mattress through into my mother's room because my father came on a tour group here for the World Cup, and watching hours and hours of cricket and being disappointed when I had to go to school.
And of course, remarkably in time, you had the opportunity to meet and to speak with Mandiba.
Yeah, I mean, that was the incredible thing. I mean, I got to meet some amazing people along the way, and obviously he was the top of that list. I remember driving down the road when I got appointed captain, got a call, say, please hold for the president of South Africa, which was a pretty surreal moment. I pulled over the side of the road in shock, trying to figure out whether it was a radio disc jockey that was trying to prank me on something. So for the first sort of probably minutes of the conversation, I didn't say too much, and then realized the gravity of the man and what he was saying to me. And I mean, he had such an open door type policy with someone like me. It was, whatever you need, just give me a call, and want to be there to guide you and help you and support you. We're proud of you. That was the messages that was coming out from someone like him that was just mind blowing. And I got to meet him on 2 other occasions, and he was just a guy that had an incredible aura, way about him, took things in his stride, and I never felt any personal grudges of him for what he had been through. It was just an incredible experience and a life lesson to spend some time with him.
How was it that in the end that cricket ended up ahead of soccer and rugby in your affections as a boy? Because you were good at both of those and you enjoyed them.
I did. I mean, I loved all sports. I mean, I was competitive at all of it growing up. It was kind of funny in many ways. I mean, I played always at the top levels, but then as age groups went up and things got really competitive in those other sports, I probably didn't enjoy it as much as I did as a young kid, But cricket was different. I mean, I loved playing age groups above myself. I remember playing first team club cricket with grown men when I was 13 and 14. And I just loved those environments, and I thrived on it, and I wanted that competitive nature with cricket. And with cricket also, it was never enough. I had the energy in the mind that I could go and hit balls. I mean, I'd play... my brother, I reckon, was more talented than me, but I'd play school cricket on the Sunday and I'd play club cricket on the Saturday and club cricket on the Sunday, and he'd be like, no, and then I've got to go to school Monday. There's no ways. But for me, that's what I enjoyed, So it was a natural energy, a natural thing for me.
To begin with 2 double centuries and 714 runs at 79 in that series, I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, the pressure you must have felt, because there was some mocking, wasn't there, or some ridiculing of you getting the job at that age. You didn't perform particularly well in the 1 day as leading into it. And then suddenly you've just run amok.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I don't think it was all roses when I got appointed. There were a lot of people saying it was a ridiculous decision for many reasons. I mean, and I can resonate with that. A 22-year-old is a risk. And I was extremely naive in terms of what actually lay ahead of me as a captain at that level, and then captain of South Africa with the challenges that you have as a leader in that environment. And I think Bob Woolmer in particular was really outspoken about it, and various other people. Moving into England, as you say, we had a tough ODI series. We lost in the final at Lord's with England really badly. But then I was fortunate post that we had a sort of a 2.5 week where we did some county stints before the first test, and we played on some good wickets, and I managed to get some hundreds in those games. I actually almost started to feel myself settle. I mean, the 1 day series for me was just like a nervous wreck from the start, trying to find my place. But in those warm-up games, I started to settle, find a bit of rhythm with the team, find a natural space as an opening batter and as a young leader. And then moving into the first test in Edgbaston, NASA started his stuff with me. He started writing articles calling me what's his name in the press. And I'll never forget walking out to toss, the nerves that I had at Edgbaston, and he came over with the mascot and he introduced me to the mascot as Greg. So I'll never forget that. And 277 runs later, I think he knew who I was. He ended up resigning after that game, and then we went to Lords. We won the toss. We bowled first. I think we bowled England out for 150 or 160, and walked out to bat that afternoon and drove one to point. And NASA dropped me, and 259 runs later, he was walking off abusing me. So it was actually a funny story in the end, it ended up being the most incredible start. I remember sitting down with former England captains along that tour, trying to learn, trying to grow. It was a fascinating experience for the 2.5 months that we were there.
Well, that was the first of the three captains, of course, England captains that you got rid of. You've followed with Michael Vaughan and later Andrew Strauss. I mean, looking back, the victories against England and then against Australia, to win successive series in both countries is really a remarkable achievement. Was that the pinnacle?
For me, yes. I think also from a performance perspective, obviously always seemed to do really well in England. I enjoyed playing cricket there. Batted well, and as a team, we were successful on our tours there. I drew that series in 2003, the first one, and then in 2008, we went on to win that series, and I probably played, for me, one of the best innings I think I've played in my career at Edgbaston. On the final day, on the fourth day, final innings, we were in real trouble, chasing 260 or 270. And ended up getting 150 odd not out, and just the whole situation. And if you lose that test going to the Oval, it's going to be difficult to beat England to win the series. So that moment for me will stay with me. I think that being in the zone and playing in innings that you remember, that was certainly one of them. Another one was coming to Perth. That first time we won in Australia and getting that 100 in the second innings. Those 200s really stood out for me in terms of the victories and kick-starting and making impacts on those moments that you talk about. But I think the greatest disappointment I had in my career was not getting to a World Cup final. I would have loved to have played in a World Cup final. But ultimately, there were reasons for all of that. But certainly the highlights that stand out for me were winning away from home and winning in England and Australia.
It's often said that there are many similarities in attitude and demeanour between Australia and South Africa, the way they play. Is that a fair statement?
Well, absolutely. I think there's that same competitive nature. We brought up in similar environments, outdoors, good weather climates, love playing sport. I would say there's probably a more hard-nosed nature to Australian cricketers than I think South African ones. I think South African ones maybe are brought up slightly gentler, in terms of demeanour and mindset, and almost need to learn to be a lot harder and firmer and tougher. It's probably not our natural nature to be that way. That was my experience, and over time that grows, that competitive edge, that hardness, it comes into your game. And I certainly learned that in 05 and 06, and I think those are the wonderful things, is that you can bounce back from that and really come and achieve great things.
And you inculcated that hardness as you saw in it, because you were renowned for being a hard player. You had some very celebrated exchanges, particularly with Shane Warne. A lot of that came from what you learned in combat with Australia.
Yeah, I think originally it just started out as enthusiasm. In my debut series, it really was just enthusiasm, and that's how. I was playing for a province team that was very successful, and I was scoring a lot of runs. That was kind of, as a young guy, I was the energy driver. That's, 20, 21 years old. And the guys encouraged me to be that way. And when I started playing for South Africa, it was just almost natural to me to be that enthusiastic, play the game that certain way. And you in that great Australian team, you learnt a few things very, very quickly. There were some hard grown men there with outstanding cricket talents that put you under a lot of pressure. So I mean, that was the first lesson. And then kind of 05-06, I remember after Perth, Shane Warne was putting a lot of our guys under a lot of pressure in the media and publicly, and you could almost feel a sense of that growing and building within your environment. So I stupidly thought, let me take on more pressure for myself and take the heat off some of the players. Probably very naive, and I certainly got the attention, and and it got very heated. But I still remember after that MCG Boxing Day test having a word with Warnie afterwards, chatting through some of the stuff. But he was a master at it. I mean, he could perform without it even affecting him. I mean, it was incredible. I mean, getting to know him later in life during the IPL and becoming friends, I think was a highlight also.
Yeah, that's interesting. That the Rajasthan Royals and the IPL, where the whole nature of the relationship changed, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but I think it's just natural when you get to spend some time with someone. You get to know the real person. Generally in those days, it was just on the cricket field, or you'd have a beer after the game, but you never really got the quality time to actually spend time with somebody, get to know them as a person and who they really are. And the IPL allowed that space for Warnie and myself. Our relationship grew from strength to strength, and we ultimately became friends. And we won the first IPL together, which was an amazing experience to play in that first IPL, win it. And that memory will stay with me, right throughout. It was one of the highlights of my career as an experience.
Is that one of the pluses that has come from IPL, that in fact that all cricket can benefit? Some of the cultural barriers and the misunderstandings and the misinformation that circulates at certain levels can be broken down somewhat. I mean, even Harbhajan Singh and Andrew Simon seem to have a rapport somewhere, which seems extraordinary. But is it something that can happen?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as long as you're open-minded and you go there with that mindset, it's no doubt. I mean, you're in an environment with so many different cultures, and I think that comes easier to a South African because we're exposed to so many different cultures in our own country, in our own teams, and we have many different walks of life, many different types of upbringings, religions, cultures. So we kind of predisposed, and we have that mindset, but so it's easier for us to probably integrate into those spaces. But to live with Indian cricketers and watch how they operate and eat, and I'll never forget Yusuf Pathan smashing a whole rice and dal before we were about to go on the field. And I was like, buddy, how are you going to move out there? But he was fine, eh? It was just a different experience, and watching how they prepare and getting to know them. I mean, friends were made across country barriers that would never have been done if it wasn't for the IPL.
I love that image of you with the mace. When South Africa was the number one team in the world, and you had Miss You Bouch on, you'd written on your shirt. What did it mean for you then to be the number one test team in the world under your leadership?
Well, I think we were ready for it. It was an important space. We needed to. We had the team. We had grown to a level where we should have been dominating, and we started to really dominate Test cricket all around the world. That tour to England was kind of the big stepping stone to that place. And it was wonderful to get over the line. I mean, it started in a really terrible way with Bouch's injury at Somerset. I mean, I'll never forget getting up to him and thinking that he just, maybe cut his cheek or whatever, and seeing, his eyeball and the mucus and the goo just sort of coming out of his eye. I'll never forget that. And spending nights in hospital with him before he went home, and that kind of shook us. But I think the environment was so strong then that we were able to regroup, replan, and be tactically smart from there. And we went on and won that first test at the Oval so convincingly. I was actually, funny enough, my 100th test for South Africa, and I got 100 in that game. I'll never forget. I was calm, I was ready, and Hashim played beautifully. Got a 300. I think the first time a South African had done that. And we were behind on day one. I remember the newspapers. Gary was telling me that the newspapers were slagging us off after day one. That we were a disgrace. We should give people their money back because we hadn't prepared well enough. Because we had a training camp in Switzerland before arriving there, and come day 4 we had won the Test match. So it's amazing how things can turn around, and that's the beauty of Test match cricket, is that you have that opportunity to ebb and flow and change the game. And we played well throughout that series. It was a tight cliffhanger at Lords to win 2-0, and then we came to Australia. And I think there was a 6-year period where we never lost away from home, which was an incredible feat.
Well, it's the mark of a greatness of a side, because as it's transpired consistently since World War II, really, to win away has been very, very difficult. So that in itself is an astonishing achievement. People in Australia, of course, look back to the courage you showed with the broken hand. And I was wondered whether you always had that grit and courage even from a young age.
No, I definitely did. I think it was ingrained in me. I remember one occasion I used to run a lot of cross-country stuff at school. I was quite athletic before I got to 6'3" and 110 kilos. I was quite athletic at a certain age, and I remember one day I got really bad stomach cramps on a run, and I pulled out of this run. And my mother, just chatted to me afterwards, and in her kind, soft way but firm, said to me that no matter what, you finish. And I think that always stayed with me. I think that was the nature of my family. We were resilient. We came from humble beginnings. My dad started his own business. Mother worked a couple of jobs and raised a family. So that resilience was in us, and that courage to sort of keep pushing. And I think that kind of stayed with me right throughout my career.
Unlike rugby, cricket was anxious to rid itself of the sort of the Springbok look. I mean, cricket was very proactive in the development with Steve Sweaty and many others at that period, as you were growing up, more so than the rugby community. And, of course, took on the protea as a symbol very early. And then, of course, you took it one step further with Protea Fire. Tell us a bit about how that came about.
To be honest with you, I mean, it came about for various reasons. I mean, I think the first IPL was in 2008. So the real money started to come into the game of cricket at that point. I mean, we were all earning decent enough salaries, but I mean, IPL changed the game for players for the rest of their lives, and I think that was one reason. The South African team had reached a point where we were performing really well. We had won in Australia. We were arriving in Australia, but how do we create a consistency? And the tactics was there, the players were there, we were playing well, we were successful. But it was when I walked out to bat with a broken hand, which is not something that I'd planned to do or expected to do, and it was actually a funny story. I mean, I didn't even arrive with kit that day, and I took whites off other guys. I think it was Jacques' pants and top, and I got Paul Harris's jersey. There was a burger stain on it. I walked to the back of the change room and thought, damn it, how am I going to get through this? I had injections into my elbow for the tennis elbow that I'd been carrying, because now I had 6 weeks off with a broken hand. So I thought, well, let's get this right. And this hand was in the cast. So I was barely holding that bat, and I walked into the back, and there was Callis sitting quietly as he always does, and he looked at me and he said, "Chicks dig scars, glory lasts forever." So I thought, I better get away from him. Let me go find a quiet place that makes some sense. And next minute I was walking out, and Micaiah was my senior partner for the first time in my whole batting career. And we fell 11 balls short. But I think it was then I got on the plane that night, the standing ovation at Sydney, the way people responded to us as a team and me over the broken hand. And I arrived in South Africa the next day, and there were hundreds of people at the airport. And obviously people were over the moon with us beating Australia for the first time, but it was how they responded to the broken hand in that moment that started to make me think about how we impact so many people on a greater scale to the hundreds that we score and the catches we take in the 5-wicket hauls. So I started contemplating this, and we had a psychologist at the time, Jeremy Snape, that was working with us. I originally met him in the IPL. And when he got home from the ODI series, we started talking about the culture of the team and how to, create a consistent edge, a dream for cricketers to look up to. Because when I started playing for South Africa, there was no real traditions. No one really knew what the Proteas stood for. There was no values. I mean, we had a couple of toasts, but pretty much besides being extremely proud to represent your country, there was no real value system that we stood for. And so we managed to scrape some money out of Cricket South Africa, and Jeremy and a guy that was involved with the All Blacks culture stuff came out and did all this research on stuff that we chatted about. So they went and looked at the Protea, for example. Found some amazing things about the Protea, that it's a really resilient flower. It's the first flower to regenerate after a fire. So resilience and fire became kind of a value system. We found that Proteus was a Greek god, and because he could see the future, he had to tell the truth. So honesty, So we kind of created some values around this and presented it to the players in a really powerful DVD and things that we put together. And it was actually incredible how that opened the door for people to have honest conversations about their upbringings, their cultures, and how we started to understand each other through this value system. And then we added, when you probably hear Madiba talk about Ubuntu a lot. The Samoan people, for example, they get their strength from the rivers or the mountains that they're born next to. And South Africa is about people and connection to people, and how you impact on them, and vice versa. And that became a really strong theme wherever we went in the world. We used to talk about that, standing in front of 90,000 people at the MCG. We used to talk about that connection that we had with people at home, and how we were impacting them, and that became a really powerful theme within our setup. So that culture just grew and grew and grew, and was a big reason why we started saving games we shouldn't have saved, winning games we shouldn't have won. There was an edge to us that was probably far greater than the individual.
And how do you? I mean, that is a great legacy. And is it being carried forward? Are you ensuring that it's been carried forward?
Well, it's obviously up for generations to do that. I mean, they're players there now that were part of the beginning process, and have taken that mantle on and grown it. I mean, I believe one of the things that Faf talks about his turnaround is they actually went back and re-looked at some of that stuff again, that maybe they'd lost their way a little bit in terms of that culture. And before the Aussies toured in the ODI series, they had a 3-day workshop again, working on the culture, the stuff that was in place for that period. I think he's alluded to that in one or two interviews. So it's an important legacy that I'd like to see carry on. I mean, it is crucial to the longevity of South African cricket, for the youngsters coming through to see that that's the space that they want to be a part of. I mean, it took a few years for Cricket South Africa to actually latch on to it and use it from a marketing perspective. Now the whole image around the team is Protea Fire, but within the setup, it started a couple of years before it kind of someone found a marketing brain and took it elsewhere.
Can we go back to the start? There's so much talk when people talk about you as a boy, with all the pledges on the fridge on what was achievable and what you wanted to do. Was the leadership one of those points on the fridge?
It was. It wasn't something that I sucked out of my thumb. I was a young cricketer doing reasonably well, and I got picked to go to this academy. They picked, it was for 13-year-olds, but they invited me down. And they had this psychologist there, Dr. Andre Roux. I'll never forget him. He was all about controlling your breathing and meditation. And as an 11-year-old, you can imagine, I was like, wow, what are we doing here? But the one thing that I did get out of that was goal setting. He taught us to set some goals, short-term, medium, and long. And on all my long-term goals, were all South African cricket based. It was actually, scoring 100 against Australia was one of the goals that I wrote down there at the time, and the other was to captain my country.
Other than Jimmy Cook and his impact, was there a particular player that you watched with particular fascination playing for South Africa or against South Africa?
I think there were many, and I think being exposed to international sports again and international cricket just opened my eyes to all the different talents and people and personalities, and obviously doing a lot of reading and in the newspapers, and trying to figure out how different people operate. But the ones who kind of come to mind, I think John Barnes. I'm a massive Liverpool fan, and John Barnes, I was a left footer growing up, and I used to love the way that he played. Steve Waugh in the early days was someone that intrigued me an immense amount. I remember reading his captain's diaries and so on as I was going through late teenage years. But I think from a South African perspective, probably someone like Gary Kirsten. I think opening batter, a similar nature type style player, even though we had different strengths and weaknesses. But I think in many ways, opening the batting, a bit gritty, not a natural like A.B. de Villiers or Callis. We had to work hard for our stuff. So I think those guys. But I think it was always important for me to try and figure out who I was. And take little bits from everybody else. And I always felt that one of my greatest strengths early on was that I understood my own strengths and weaknesses as a person and as a cricketer. And I think understanding that is one of the reasons why I was able to be successful at a young age.
Did the Steve Waugh mental disintegration impact on you as a young boy when he talked about mental disintegration, what that meant, how tough you had to be?
It didn't. I was fortunate that when I got picked, I was in outstanding form. I was pumping out runs for Western Province and made my debut at Newlands. That first innings, the nerves just got to me. Glenn McGrath, I remember, got me out. And I walked out to bat in the second innings. It was a drinks break, and the pressure was on. And Warren was bowling. We had Langer, Hayden, Steve Waugh was at short fine leg. I think Mark Waugh was at slip, and Warney was in full fettle. And I remember Steve Bucknell and Rudy Coutson were the umpires actually. And I think my first 20 balls, I scraped my way through, just until I calmed down. And I remember there was a moment when I came down and I hit Warren over mid-on for 4. Kind of everything settled a little bit there, and so I don't think it had anything to do with mental disintegration. It was just pure nerves in my first experience against Steve and the great team. And went on to Durban and got a 40 and a 50 again, and then did well in the one-day series subsequently. And never really got to play against Steve again after that. Ricky took over, and it became most of my stuff against Australia became against Ricky and Michael Clarke.
Is it true that your father wanted you to bat right-handed when you were a kid?
He did. No one in our family had ever batted left-handed before. And I was playing in the garden, and he kept trying to change me, and I kept trying to pick up the bat left-handed. He's like, no, there's something wrong here. Bat right-handed. I was pretty fortunate that I didn't listen to him. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you.
And of course, the joy of Newlands. It's the gorge. I'm from Adelaide, and it was always talk that Adelaide Oval and Newlands, Cape Town, the two most beautiful grounds in the world. What are reflections, particularly, of the grounds around the world of which you're fondest?
Yeah, obviously Newlands became a home ground for me, and I always loved grounds that when you arrived there and it was empty, you almost could feel the atmosphere anyway. And I think Newlands was one of those for me. Lords was another one, and two grounds that I did well at also, and we did well as teams in. So I have great memories in those places. At Newlands, I can still smell the brewery, see the haze on a hot summer day. It's just a beautiful place to be out. Even if you're toiling in the sun, it doesn't feel that way, and there's always a good crowd and a more knowledgeable crowd in South Africa. There were experiences of grounds like, a Boxing Day test match at the MCG with 90,000 people is just an experience that you can't explain to many people. When you walk out and you see these stands just surrounding you, it's incredible. I got 100 at Eden Gardens in an ODI game when Chappell was the coach, and there was a very polarised relationship with him and the Indian team, and he just left Ganguly out. And I got 100, and we ended up winning by 10 wickets. But my memory of that is 100,000 Indian fans started cheering for us at the end of the game because of Chappell leaving out Ganguly. So that was the most support I think I've ever received in one stadium. So there's so many wonderful grounds and experiences that you have, but I think probably those are the ones that stand out.
It's an extraordinary amount of cricket in 12 years, from March 2002 to 2014, your 9,265 test runs. At the end, when you made the decision to finish, was it difficult, or do you think you'd done your time?
There were various reasons. I think 11 years of captaincy had taken its toll. I think I needed almost a break from it in some way. I was going through a real tough personal time also off the field. And then my daughter got burnt with hot water in the PE test. So my whole last test match for South Africa, I'd spend the morning in hospital with her, having sort of a type of surgery done with the plastic surgeons to fix her. And then I'd arrive at the ground and try and play a test match. So I was mentally just absolutely nowhere at that stage, considering everything that was going on. And I just felt that I needed to put a peg in the ground and stop, and that's exactly what happened. I ended up retiring young at 33. And if I'm honest, about 6 months to a year later, I felt really good again. I reckon I could have played for another few years, but with the personal stuff and my children needing me around, it was just never right to go and take the steps to play again, which would require obviously an immense amount of commitment and travel and focus. So it never quite worked out again. And in the end, I'm not disappointed. I'm extremely proud of what I achieved. I think I left it on top of the game, with a record that, as a captain and as a player, that I didn't ever think I'd be able to achieve.
Is it possible, do you think, for someone to lead longer than you led? I mean, it's an astonishing...
Well, probably Alan Border would have said no if you had asked him. What was he, 94 tests? So he probably would have said no if you had asked him that question. I think everything's possible. I think with the 3 formats now and the pressures and the stresses, I think it'll be very, very difficult. The game of cricket is changing very, very quickly. The landscape is changing very quickly. I'm a little bit worried about where it's sitting at the moment in terms of administration. They need to give cricket far more context and direction, and we almost need a really good ICC board or CEO that has some strength and direction to give the game what it needs going forward. And so I'm a little bit worried about where the game sits at the moment. It's a little bit in the balance with all this free agency and 2020 leagues, and it's exciting, and it's bringing a new fan base in, and players are earning good money. But I think the international game is sitting in a precarious position.
And just finally, Test match cricket, do you fear for its future?
I think everybody does, but everybody that has played the game will tell you there's no ways it can go away. I don't think there's a cricketer that has played the game that won't respect the fact that Test cricket is the pinnacle. I think it's the greatest test of your skill. You can get away with things in 2020. You can be a bits and pieces type cricketer in ODI in 2020, but you'll never survive in Test cricket. It's the greatest test of you mentally, emotionally, skill-wise. And if you've got something, that's where you'll make it. But you also have to move with the times, and those other formats play their roles. But I truly hope, and you still watch Test matches today, where it ebbs and flows, and it's so exciting that you can't believe that the game doesn't have a future.
That's great, mate. Thank you. That's excellent.